Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk, serving risk professionals and decision makers across specialty insurance markets, reinsurance and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and welcome to this special episode in association with Mosaic Insurance. Our topic is the political violence outlook for the US presidential election, set for November the 5th, 2024, between Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, representing the Democrats, and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance on the Republican ticket. And for this big topic, I'm joined by two superb guests, Tina Fordham and Adam McGrath. Tina Fordham is the founder of Fordham Global Foresight and a geopolitical strategist and advisor. Tina is a trailblazer in the field of global political risk. She has a distinguished track record of advising senior leaders, from CEOs to generals and the United Nations, about the intersection between geopolitics, markets, and the business environment. Tina previously worked as the chief global political analyst at Citi, and she serves in a number of board-level advisory roles. In 2022, Tina founded Fordham Global Foresight, which is an independent consultancy dedicated to advising boards and the C-suite about how to raise their PQ, that is, their political quotient. Adam McGrath is the global head of war, terrorism, and political violence at Mosaic Insurance. Adam is responsible for building out Mosaic's international political violence book, while complementing work by the unit's North American team. He has 20 years of experience starting as a broker in terrorism business, working in the PVT space since 2006. Previously, Adam spent 8 years at AXA XL, expanding its political violence line, and also worked at Hiscox. Prior to underwriting, he served as a broker for Aon's crisis management division, focused on terrorism. Adam also represents Mosaic as a member of the Lloyd's Market Association Political Violence Panel. And so let's get on with the topic at hand. Adam and Tina, thank you for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
Tina, if I could kick off with a question for you, please. If we cast our minds back just as far as July, when the Biden-Trump debate took place, and then shortly after that, the Trump assassination attempt, it really did seem like Donald Trump was on course to win big in November. But as things stand now, how tight do things look? Is it too close to call?
Well, this was always going to be an election that didn't follow the usual US elections playbook, first of all. In terms of the wider implications of who sits in the White House, starting from January 20th, 2025, expectations had been that it would be between former President Trump and current President Joe Biden, and that's all been upended. What I've been suggesting for some time is that it shouldn't have been such a surprise, although the dramatic way that it came about in the aftermath of President Biden's shaky performance, to put it mildly, in the June presidential debate seemed like a surprise to many. What I'd say right now, though, is that there's still room for more wild cards and twists and turns. I've been advising my clients for a long time now that looking at the US elections in terms of the usual kind of horse race metrics, who's going to win, really won't be enough to anticipate what's going to happen. And when it comes to the world of insurance, the possible scenarios emerging from US elections are far beyond a clear winner emerging on November 6th. So I want to be clear about that. The idea that we are out of suspense and can move on November 6th with a winner, I think is a fallacy. So I would address that first. There are still multiple scenarios that can emerge in US elections. Looking at the current state of the race, just looking at those horse race polls, in the very short time that Kamala Harris, the vice president, has been the Democratic Party nominee, her momentum has been significant. I remember talking to a group of early stage tech investors hosted by a large US investment bank in June, and they were completely convinced of a Trump victory. I would say that's still the prevailing view on Wall Street. And now, in the space of a really compressed period of time, a lot of the political laws of gravity when it comes to US elections, and this is the 5th US election that I've covered professionally, have been broken. So you asked about a call or a forecast. I think you'll find that very few American pollsters are making calls.
It's kind of within the margin for error, right?
Well, it's getting to be beyond the margin of error, but they also made some big mistakes in previous elections, and that's because of the US Electoral College phenomenon. At this time in 2020, Hillary Clinton, according to some leading American pollsters, had a 90% probability of victory, although anyone who understands probabilities knows that even a 10% probability of something happening is meaningful. She went on to win the popular vote, but not to win the Electoral College, and that caused a big upset. I was on the trading floor the morning after at a leading US investment bank when those results came in, and it was my responsibility to communicate them. And there was real shock. So, fool me once, as the expression goes. Every responsible pollster will tell you a poll is a snapshot and not a forecast. So I really want to urge caution about how we look at polls. Harris has momentum and Trump doesn't. Trump hasn't been much on the campaign trail. He has left his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, whose ratings are in negative territory, the most unpopular vice presidential candidate in modern US history, to do the campaigning for him. So he has some momentum to recover from. So it's too close to call. And that means that if we want to try to anticipate this outcome, we've got to look at a wider range of factors. And I would argue we need to be prepared for a range of wildcards as well, because we had that July surprise, two of them, in the form of the attempted assassination on former President Trump and the elevation of Kamala Harris to the Democratic ticket. October, even early November surprises are all plausible. And I'd like to close with another reminder about the 2008 race, which was, if you'll recall, fought on an anti-war, anti-Iraq war platform by none other than Barack Obama, because it wasn't until September 2007 that Lehman Brothers went bust and the US recession risk took off from there. It was not an election issue. The US economy and the global financial crisis hadn't started. And arguably, it was when Republican candidate John McCain said the fundamentals of the US economy are strong in September, October, that he lost that race. It was the wrong issue for the times ahead, but the right issue for the times behind. So plenty of room for more surprises between now and November 5th.
Tina, I'm very fond of looking at history and drawing some parallels where appropriate. You observed recently that the 2024 Democratic National Convention held in Chicago in late August had gone very smoothly without any of the big protests that characterized, for example, the DNC in 1968 in Chicago, which is a big historical year of American civil unrest. Political assassinations, student protests, civil rights, anti-war protests in the US and around the world. Does that year of US political violence still have some relevant parallels with 2024?
That's not what the fear of political violence that people are talking about when they talk about violence in US elections. 1968, I was born in 1968, was an incredibly political year in the United States, with assassinations of Martin Luther King, the anti-war protests, anti-Vietnam War protests. Obviously in Europe, we had the Soissons-Huitard, the labor protests and others. It was a year of incredible upheaval in the form of civil unrest. So when people talk about political violence in America, they are talking about reaction to the possibility of Trump losing this election.
There have been plenty of protests, certainly protests about events in the Middle East, campus protests going on in the US and elsewhere. Is that going to be a factor in the political violence outlook running up to November?
So one of the dogs that didn't bark at the recent Democratic National Convention in Chicago was fears of Middle East protests against the Biden administration. Now, many would argue that the reason there weren't protests is because those voices were curtailed. We didn't see a lot of speeches that came out against US support of Israel. It was all quite carefully orchestrated. Harris accomplished something important at the DNC, bearing in mind that the Democratic Party in the United States is a very big tent. You've got everybody from far left, the so-called progressive left, Bernie Sanders supporters, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, there's Middle Eastern protesters and others. And Harris did what she needed to do, which is to bring those elements together. You heard her scold some of the voices who attempted to protest and make remarks and interrupt her with her now famous "I'm speaking" comeback. But it's going to be important for Harris to keep the Democratic Party together. It's highly likely that those campus-based US protests will resume. Big question is about whether that opposition serves to depress turnout for Democrats, or whether there is a way to kind of placate and acknowledge those voices and keep their support going. I also am on the International Advisory Board of Columbia University, which has been at the center of all of this. The president resigned after criticism. It's going to be something to watch. And of course, there have been wider implications of the protests with people like Bill Ackman and others threatening, or in some cases withdrawing, their financial support from large US institutions. Will they bring about damage to property or to person? It remains to be seen.
Well, speaking of damage to property, etc., it's a good time to bring you into the conversation. We have seen civil unrest in the US in recent years. Certainly the Black Lives Matter protests just a few years ago, and of course the Capitol Hill attack or insurrection, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum in terms of how the words people use for these events. But perhaps for BLM in particular, was an event that went on for longer and was more widespread. Yeah, where did the claims activity occur in the US insurance market?
It was predominantly retained in the all-risk property market. I mean, terrorism is a peril post 9/11 was excluded, but we abbreviate strikes, right, civil commotion, to SRCC, and the SRCC perils have typically been listed within the all risks insurance. Broader PV perils such as war are excluded, but they've never really been considered as a realistic loss scenario on US soil. I mean, the property losses from BLM were north of $1 billion. And some property insurers did opt to try and exclude them going forward, but for the most part, they are still covered in the property. So if we were to see that scale of event again, it would largely be within the property. I mean, that isn't the case globally. There are certain countries and regions in the world where the SRCC exposure does fall within our market, the political violence market. But as it stands, the lion's share is still retained domestically. As I said, the odd property insurer does exclude, and we see small orders for gap fills on a reinsurance basis. But as I said, the most of the SRCC exposure is still on the property.
And in some of that multinational clients, they're buying PV for their global operations, and they may well intention it for it to be somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps front of mind, but in fact, they're also covered for it in the US. Is that also a factor for some clients?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, most of our SRCC exposure in the States is born out of US domiciled businesses who buy broader political violence coverage because of the perceived higher risk threat in places like the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia. And almost by default, if a scenario were to play out, they actually have the coverage for any loss in the US. But as I said, from a standalone basis, that most of the US exposure is still within the property. And I think some of the stats I've seen kind of globally of late would drive, I think, a big change to that. And I've actually just seen a quote from Allianz post the events in New Caledonia, but just some kind of loss scenarios to kind of add some colour. In Chile in 2019, the loss nationwide was $4.5 billion. In France recently, after Paris, and it kind of bled into some other cities, it was 650 million across a weekend. And New Caledonia, as I said recently, is probably north of $1 billion. The major concern from these perils is systemic loss and this potential for what we call sideways exposure. And apart from contagious disease, there aren't really many events that can spread over an entire country like social unrest. And the common theme is people. I mean, during BLM, there were cases of damage and looting from New York to LA. And I always use the example of nationwide chain of superstores, because you could have one store that suffers a $2 million looting loss, but if this occurs in 30 towns across 20 states, you've got a potential loss of over $1 billion just from one insured. And that's obviously led, I think, to this move from Allianz. As I said, I read this morning that they're going to rewrite their wordings and not cover situations where public security is deemed out of control or non-existent. And I think if we were to see, as I said, an incident or an event similar to BLM, but with a loss kind of in the 5 to 10 billion range, that would really move to a shift in the domestic US market.
So as you say, most property policies do include strikes, riots, civil commotion, SRCC. But am I right in thinking that typically terrorism policies, the SRCC type event, a PV event, would be excluded from it? What would need to have happened in order to make a PV type claim under those existing terrorism policies?
So, I mean, in the PV market, political violence covers a broad spectrum of scenarios, and different types of event are essentially split out, priced for, aggregated independently. So we have to be careful what we're referring to when we kind of talk about PV. As we said, on a property policy, PV events of terrorism and war and PV perils are excluded. But on a standalone terrorism policy, we would exclude strikes, riots, and those wider PV perils. But there are options to purchase those broader coverages. So we have the LMA 3092, which covers strikes, riots, civil commotion, including terrorism, and then a full PV policy, which covers anything from domestic risk of civil war all the way through to the external threat of a cross-border war. And the coverage required tends to follow regional patterns. So unfortunately, some countries obviously have a history of volatility, which is why we cover full PV, including war in parts of the Middle East. And then in Latin America, for example, there's always been a high demand for SRCC coverage. As it stands in the US, the demand to date has really been from that conventional terrorism threat. And while SRCC is retained on the property, that's most of what we tend to see. And that's typical, I'd say, in the West, broadly speaking.
But if you were to see claims come in from terrorism policies rather than policies designed for PV, would that require some sort of state government level classification for terrorism incident first?
Yeah, I mean, we have clear definitions within the London market wording, and obviously the law and jurisdiction of the particular policy will then carry additional weight. And there have been various incidents over the years of maybe cultural differences and state interpretation of what's actually kind of played out. We even saw it in the UK recently for the far right protesters. I think the ex-police commissioner used the word terrorism because I suppose the end of the political spectrum that we were talking about with regards to the perpetrators. So it's very much, obviously the wording is there to give insured clarity on definitions. But what we've always encouraged, and this has really been born out of the pace of change in places like the Middle East, is where the risk is potentially greater. We prefer as a class to actually offer coverage for all perils, which we, as I said, price for and aggregate for, because then that gives the client peace of mind and avoids any grey area if you do have that fluidity between the PV perils that play out.
So from a political violence specifically perspective, is the US a significant market for you? Who is buying standalone PV at the moment? And do you view that from an exposure perspective as being very different from terrorism?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we see a real mixture of clients from global manufacturers to retail, oil and gas, power utility. It's a real range, but it tends to be that, as I said, the US domiciled businesses with global exposure that buy full political violence policies. And typically the political violence coverage itself is sublimited because the scale of the loss could obviously be far greater. But we see the loss scenarios as very different. I mean, terrorism typically in isolation is a short kind of event and confined to the location that the attack happened in. Whereas for these broader perils of riots, as I said, you can have losses unravel in a kind of 2 to 3 week period. And we aggregate our limits. So we know kind of almost the worst case scenario, but I think property typically offers on an occurrence. So there is the potential for these limits to reinstate, which compounds that kind of systemic loss that I mentioned earlier.
Tina, can I bring you back in at this point? So to really get to the main course of our conversation, as you already said, there'll be so many twists and turns between now and November, and this is a race that is too close to call. So certainly it could go either way.
It could go a number of ways. This isn't a binary outcome. That's one of the things I've been stressing.
But if the outcome is a Harris win in November, what do you think is the likelihood of political violence from Trump supporters? If you do foresee unrest, do you have some thoughts on the where, the what, and the who of how it might unfold?
I mentioned the public opinion data that highlighted the high number of Republican voters who think civil war is likely. So that's a warning shot to be aware of to start with. I was interested in Adam's differentiations between political violence and terrorism in terms of coverage. I mean, looking at the recent example of the UK far-right riots, it highlights how difficult it is to ascribe these kinds of events to the different categories. But bringing it back to the United States, I'm thinking about the fact that the United States has a very high number of militias. Where a militia falls into this kind of terrorism versus political violence, I couldn't begin to say. I think it's an interesting point. But armed militias are a feature of US life going back to the founding of the country. The United States is a violent country in many ways, and it shouldn't necessarily be a surprise that we could see some kind of replay of January 6th or something more significant. I wouldn't like to say whether that's a base case scenario or anything more defined than that, because there is time for US voters to process the direction of the results. And, on terms of wildcards, will Trump stay on the candidate? Will there be any further legal action? Will there be any more changes to the ticket? We are really living in extraordinary political times, and our conversation about what happened between June and August highlights that. If we look ahead to November 5th and plausible scenarios with material probability, and this is how I would think about it, I expect a delay to certifying the result at the official level. I think that's highly likely in certain states. Georgia, for example, will be a major battleground there. There will be changes and attempted changes in the procedure, in ballot counting. That isn't necessarily likely to trigger civil unrest or protests or worse, but it means a delay. And the last time there was a delay in US elections certifying the result was Bush-Gore in 2000 and the hanging chads in Florida. That was resolved by the Supreme Court. And even though Al Gore, I don't think, was very happy with the outcome, the result was accepted. Will that be the case, or would that be the case this time in 2024, when, by contrast, the level of public support for the Supreme Court and belief that it's impartial has dropped precipitously? It's now in the low 20s. So that is remarkable. An extended delay, would that be a market event? For insurance purposes, that's something else. I don't think that sufficient attention is being paid to this range of scenarios. So certification, delays in recognition, possibility of referral to the Supreme Court, and possibility that a Supreme Court decision is not respected. These are all quite plausible in my mind. There also will be almost certainly very close results, right? I mean, I think the narrowness of victory from either candidate is going to be at issue, recounts, et cetera. And that will unfortunately lead to suggestions of vote rigging and everything else. So bottom line is, don't expect a clear result on November 6th. I think delays heading into the new year are quite likely. Remember that the next president, and we will have a change, takes their seat January 20th, no matter what. That's how the Constitution is written. So we've got that lame duck period as well before a transfer of power. It's a contrast to the UK, where Rishi Sunak was out and Keir Starmer was in, I think, within about 12 hours. So that is something that's quite different. And of course, the rest of the world is watching, and other countries where democracy is perhaps less entrenched in terms of rule of law and respect for institutions are also watching closely. So very unusual times ahead.
Dina, can I ask, do you think, I mean, we mentioned the potential for a repeat of the 6th of January kind of insurrection at Capitol Hill, and do you think the jail terms will serve as a kind of deterrent to maybe something similar happening again? When I look to the riots in the UK, and the government was very quick to act in terms of creating prison space, naming and shaming of everyone involved, particularly with kind of far-right tendencies, which is pretty much irrecoverable as an individual. And people were kind of given 2 to 3 year jail sentences. And I remember that the aftermath of the Capitol Hill, there were ex-Marines kind of sobbing in court at what they'd done and with 10-year plus jail terms. So do you think that that could be re-advertised, for want of a better word, with regards to stopping a repeat?
It's a really good point, but we wouldn't see that in the US case. And the profile of the protesters and the catalyst is quite different. The far-right protests in the UK, it appears that a number of the perpetrators there were known to police, had previous records of civil disruption, and just as an aside, the commonalities with the problems the UK used to have with football hooliganism are quite interesting. In the United States, the promise of a presidential pardon from the White House really changes the calculus, if you can use that term, for the protesters, and the sense of acting in defense of a higher cause makes it different from the civil unrest over the so-called, I think, misnamed anti-immigration protests here in the UK. There's a whole typology about protests, violence, revolutions. I did a lot of work on this in my Vox Populi thesis in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and kind of understanding the trajectory and the features of the different types of protests is part of what is going to come to the fore, because we're really talking about respect for independent institutions, respect for the Constitution as the bedrock for what happens next in US elections, and then the knock-on effects to other democracies in the world and the message that it will send.
Tina, I wanted to ask you the same question really as I already did, but this time for a Trump victory scenario. I take the point that the result may be subject to some disputes and take time to work out. But when we do know, and if it is a Trump victory, would we also expect political violence to occur? I think we wouldn't expect Harris to not acknowledge that she had lost in that scenario in the same way that perhaps Trump would. But among her supporters, bearing in mind what happened with the popular vote for Hillary Clinton, would you expect people to not accept the result? And, would you expect political violence to occur? And if so, how might it differ in its character from the Harris win?
So the main consequence, I think, in that case would be a lack of political legitimacy if the result was close and if there were deemed to be irregularities. And again, that's where we're really in unpredictable territory, because we're talking about human psychology. And this notion of legitimacy is not really something that can be gamed by either side. And it is a consequence of polarization, which is something that has been apparent in US political life going back a couple of decades. And I want to emphasize here, is not present in anything like the same levels in the UK, in the European Union countries, or indeed in our OECD peers. US polarization has been incremental. Frog boiling is the term, and the consequences of polarization take us to the juncture where we are now, where it's entirely plausible that neither the Democrats or Republicans would recognize the victory of the other. But the point of violence and protests is less likely, in my view, in the event of a Trump victory than in the event of a Harris victory, for reasons that are too complicated to go into here. But I would still expect legal challenges and other delays. And that leads, again, to another set of problems. May not directly impact insurance premiums, but it'll impact deal making, possibly with wider implications for the US economy and financial markets, and then things like approving US budget, raising the debt ceiling, and other matters.
With regards to the Middle East, traditionally support from the US for Israel has been absolute. How do you see the result of the election potentially changing that and the impact that could have on the Middle East, or the tensions in the Middle East?
Well, the US stance on the conflict in the Middle East and its support for Israel has been more prominent in the 2024 election campaign than we're used to seeing for a foreign policy issue, whether that's the feedback loop from the campus protests that we discussed earlier, to Arab Americans, Muslim Americans protesting and being influential in certain key swing states like Michigan. There is a real change in the demographics and the dynamics around the support. We don't have a lot to go on when it comes to Kamala Harris's likely stance, just given the compressed time frame of her candidacy. Going back to what she said during the Democratic National Convention, she pretty finely balanced between message of continued support for Israel, and from a hard power perspective, that's quite important. Any sense that the US was abandoning Israel as a military ally, a security ally, would spell danger for Israel and, in my view, increase the likelihood of conflagration there. So we would expect to see continued reiteration for US support of Israel. But what she showed, and this is on the soft power side of the equation, was more empathy for people in Gaza, something that many of the protesters and those critical of the White House support for Israel have complained isn't present. And whether that's enough to change the dynamics is hard to say, but I think that's the kind of nuanced messaging and balancing that we should expect to see from Harris. The real question is, what's the likelihood of a diplomatic settlement in the Middle East, and indeed between Russia and Ukraine, where I'm watching very closely the prospects of sabotage on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So the next US president really will inherit a full plate of challenges. And as much as, going back to Barack Obama, the United States has wanted to pivot to Asia, and China, of course, has not got involved overtly in either of these big centers of conflict, is evidently, really turning up the pressure there. So many implications for global conflict. The Middle East conflict hasn't yet become systemic. It hasn't triggered a major increase in oil prices. Iran would like to see a Harris presidency, and I think that can also be determined by the alleged Iranian hack on Trump's campaign, although we haven't seen those files just yet. Why? Because Iran would like to resume the P5+1 nuclear agreement that existed until President Trump withdrew the United States from it. So very complex set of factors here.
Adam, so how do these scenarios, whether it's a Trump victory or a Harris victory, look for you as a PVT underwriter? I don't just mean in claims potential, but how much it would take, using appropriate examples, to stimulate some real structural change in the US market towards buying behavior for standalone PV.
Post BLM, the loss quantum, as I said, was around $1 billion, and it was an amount that the property market could cope with. And that was at a time where property rates were increasing across the board because of the impact of wind. But when I look at some of the more global events, it's been an interesting period where there have been major occurrences that fall under the PV kind of banner in terms of our definitions, but the exposure hasn't actually sat within the PV market. I've mentioned Chile, South Africa was another example. That was a significant loss to a section of the PV market, but it certainly hasn't hardened as much as we expected it to, particularly post-Ukraine. I look at Ukraine in isolation, and it's a war that's lasted kind of over 2 years with catastrophic damage in most corners of an enormous country. But as an insured loss to the PV market, there wasn't a great deal of insured exposure there for the political violence market there. Again, most of the exposure was driven from maybe Western domicile businesses that had exposure or sites within the country. So none of this has actually culminated in huge claims to the PV market to date. If we were to see, as I said, a $5 to $10 billion type event from social unrest in the US, those SRCC exposures would definitely fall into the political violence market going forward, because property would exclude them for sure. As I said, we've started to see internationally property insurers exclude them absolutely. And if we do have that systemic type loss, that would really change the market. I think there's an awful lot of exposure in Chile now in the PV market. And if we were to see a repeat of 2019 with a $4 to $5 billion loss, that would really change the rating environment. With regards to the US and the impact of the elections, as Tina kind of touched on it, we don't expect, unlike maybe some of the more developing countries where you have riots at the ballot stations, this is more of a kind of slow burn. And as we saw in the UK, it was obviously the senseless murder of the poor girls in Southport that actually triggered the riots as opposed to the election itself. So I think there will be a separate trigger point, and tensions that will have been raised or elevated post the election result will culminate in potentially something significant happening. From my personal perspective, I think the idea of a Trump loss and those militias, which I would have thought would probably be more southern based, would be more of a kind of threat than potentially a Trump victory domestically in the US.
Adam, I'd make one observation just to leave you with. You mentioned the catalyst for the far right protests as being the murder of those girls. I would argue that it was the disinformation that was spread online.
Yeah.
And actually, for your industry, I mean, how can you prepare for that? But we have more channels and tools for spreading misinformation, and the increased likelihood, it seems to me, of these kinds of unpredictable episodic violence where different actors, whether it's Russia or internal proponents, manipulate emotion to bring this about. Entirely unpredictable.
No, I completely agree. One other point I'd actually jotted down was around the power of social media, and as you said, the spreading of fake news, and which can, as I said, spread across an entire country like wildfire. It's very difficult to keep a pace.
It's going to be a huge issue, I reckon, in the courts. I think they're going to try to haul Elon Musk in front of a parliamentary committee. That will be entertaining, and it'll be an issue in the United States as well. So, there's violence in the streets, and then there is this increased availability of instruments that can bring violence about. It makes your job a challenging one for sure. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this special episode in association with Mosaic Insurance. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my two wonderful guests, Tina Fordham and Adam McGrath. And that's all for now, but please tune in next time. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.